History is often taught in dates and names, but the true horror lives in what was done behind closed doors, where power rotted into cruelty and silence became a weapon. Tonight's story is not legend, not myth, but a fragment of human history so brutal it sounds unreal. This is the kind of past that refuses to stay buried, the kind that festers, curses, and consumes those who create it. Absolute power inside the colonial household was not loud or public. It was quiet, domestic, and absolute in a way that poisoned every corner of daily life. Within those walls, the mistress was not simply a woman managing a home, she was judge, executioner, and God to those forced to serve her. The law rarely crossed the threshold of the big house, and when it did, it bowed politely. This isolation allowed cruelty to grow unchecked, feeding on entitlement and fear, until it no longer recognized itself as evil, only as authority exercising its right. In societies built on enslavement, power did not always look like chains and whips held by men. It wore silk dresses, carried rosaries, and spoke in controlled, measured tones. Women who held power over enslaved people were often shaped by the same violent system that oppressed them in other ways, but instead of breaking it, many embraced it fully, turning their frustration, resentment, and internalized rage outward. Inside the household, they could command suffering without consequence, and that freedom corrupted the soul more effectively than any external force. The household became a closed world where empathy was treated as weakness. Every act of kindness was seen as loss of control, every mercy as rebellion waiting to happen. Over time, cruelty was not just permitted, it was encouraged. Punishments escalated not because they were necessary, but because power demands proof of itself. Once fear becomes routine, it must be intensified to remain effective. What began as discipline slowly transformed into spectacle, ritualized pain designed to reinforce dominance not just over bodies, but over minds. The most dangerous transformation was psychological. Absolute power removes the need for justification. When no one can question your actions, morality erodes. The mistress no longer saw enslaved women as human beings capable of pain and memory, but as extensions of property, tools meant to be corrected, reshaped, or destroyed if they failed to perform. Violence became personal, intimate, delivered at close range, making it more horrifying than any distant brutality. The domestic space, meant to represent order and civility, became a private theater of terror. Within this environment, punishment was no longer about correction, but about ownership. The body of the enslaved woman was treated as something to be marked, altered, and controlled in ways meant to erase autonomy completely. These acts were calculated to humiliate as much as to injure, reinforcing a hierarchy where the mistress's power extended beyond life and death into identity itself. To strip someone of their sense of self is to claim total dominion, and that claim was exercised without restraint. Society outside the household often knew what was happening and chose silence. Neighbors heard screams, servants whispered rumors, priests noticed bruises, yet nothing changed. The power of the mistress was protected by class, race, and economic interest. Her cruelty was excused as discipline, her excesses dismissed as temperament. This collective denial allowed monstrosity to thrive, creating an environment where violence was normalized and accountability erased. When evil is wrapped in respectability, it becomes invisible. Over time, the mistress herself was shaped by the violence she inflicted. Cruelty is not neutral to the one who wields it. Each act hardened her further, disconnecting her from compassion and anchoring her identity in domination. She began to measure her worth through obedience extracted from terror, through silence enforced by pain. The household mirrored her inner decay, growing colder, heavier, saturated with fear that clung to walls and followed footsteps. This transformation was not sudden, but gradual, like rot spreading beneath polished wood. At first, she believed she was maintaining order. Later, she discovered pleasure in control. Eventually, power itself became an addiction, requiring ever more extreme expressions to feel real. The system rewarded her for this descent, praising her strength, her discipline, her authority, while ignoring the human cost buried beneath routine and ritual. What makes this form of power especially terrifying is its intimacy. Violence delivered by a stranger is brutal, but violence delivered by someone who watches you daily, who knows your face, your fears, your exhaustion, carries a deeper psychological wound. The enslaved women lived under constant surveillance, never knowing when punishment would come or what form it would take. This uncertainty was itself a weapon, eroding resistance before the body was ever touched. Absolute power within the household created monsters not because women were inherently cruel, but because unchecked authority strips away boundaries that keep humanity intact. When dominance becomes identity and suffering becomes language, the line between order and atrocity disappears. In that closed world, cruelty was not an exception, it was the rule, and the woman who ruled it ceased to be merely a participant in violence and became its embodiment, a figure shaped entirely by control, fear, and the belief that she could do anything without consequence, until even the walls seemed to remember what they had witnessed, and the silence itself felt heavy, breathing, waiting. Extreme violence was not random within systems of enslavement. It was deliberate, calculated, and designed to break resistance at its root. Punishment was never only about correcting behavior, it was about reminding enslaved women that their bodies did not belong to them. Pain became a language of control, spoken fluently by those in power and understood by those who lived under constant threat. Every act of violence carried a message meant to echo long after wounds faded, reinforcing obedience through terror rather than law. For enslaved women, punishment was uniquely cruel because it targeted both body and identity. Violence was shaped around humiliation, meant to strip away dignity and selfhood. It invaded spaces that should have been private, turning womanhood itself into something that could be attacked, reshaped, or erased. These punishments were often public within the household, forcing others to witness and internalize the consequences of disobedience, ensuring fear spread faster than any overseer could enforce it. Control depended on unpredictability. The absence of clear rules meant punishment could arrive without warning, transforming daily life into a state of constant anxiety. A glance interpreted as defiance, a movement deemed too slow, a tone judged improper could trigger violence. This uncertainty kept enslaved women in a state of hypervigilance, exhausting their minds as much as their bodies. When fear becomes constant, resistance becomes almost impossible. Violence was also gendered in ways that made it especially devastating. Enslaved women were punished not only for labor-related issues, but for perceived moral failures, imagined insolence, or simply existing in ways that threatened the authority of the household. Their bodies were treated as symbols of ownership, and punishment was often designed to leave marks that could not be hidden, ensuring shame followed them even when the pain subsided. The goal was not correction, but submission so complete it reshaped how they saw themselves. Those who inflicted these punishments often justified them through distorted logic. Cruelty was framed as discipline, suffering as necessity, and excess as firmness. This language allowed perpetrators to distance themselves from the reality of their actions, turning violence into routine. When pain becomes administrative, it loses the urgency that might otherwise provoke guilt. Repetition normalized brutality, and what once might have horrified became mundane. For the victims, the psychological impact was as destructive as the physical harm. Punishment taught them that their pain was invisible, their cries meaningless. Silence became survival. Many learned to suppress reactions, to detach from their own bodies during moments of suffering, a coping mechanism that fractured identity over time. Living under constant threat eroded trust, not only in others, but in the future itself. Hope became dangerous because it could be taken away at any moment. Violence also served to isolate enslaved women from one another. Fear discouraged solidarity, turning witnesses into unwilling participants in the system. Those who survived punishment often carried guilt alongside trauma, knowing their survival depended on someone else being chosen instead. This fragmentation weakened collective resistance and ensured control remained firmly in the hands of those who ruled through terror. The most horrifying aspect of such violence was its intimacy. Punishment was delivered by people who saw these women every day, who knew their routines, their weaknesses, their exhaustion. This familiarity stripped violence of distance, making it personal and invasive. There was no escape from the gaze of power, no place where the body was entirely one's own. Even moments of rest were haunted by anticipation of the next punishment. Over time, extreme violence reshaped the entire household ecosystem. Fear became a constant presence, saturating spaces and relationships. Children learned early what obedience looked like. Other servants absorbed the lesson that survival depended on silence. The household functioned not through cooperation, but through intimidation, a fragile order maintained by cruelty rather than consent. This system of punishment also relied on the broader society's willingness to look away. Authorities rarely intervened, and when they did, it was often to protect property rather than people. The suffering of enslaved women was considered an acceptable cost of maintaining order and profit. This indifference reinforced the idea that their pain did not matter, that violence against them existed outside moral consideration. Extreme violence, repeated and unchallenged, created an environment where cruelty fed on itself. Each punishment raised the threshold for shock, requiring greater brutality to achieve the same level of fear. What began as enforcement escalated into excess, driven by the need to reaffirm dominance. In this way, punishment became performative, a ritual that reaffirmed hierarchy through suffering. The legacy of such violence did not end with the moment it was inflicted. It lingered in bodies that never fully healed, in minds shaped by fear, in memories passed quietly from one generation to the next. Even when chains were removed, the psychological scars remained, evidence of a system that relied on pain to sustain itself, and of lives forced to endure cruelty so normalized that it became invisible, woven into daily existence, shaping every breath, every movement, every silent calculation made in the shadow of power. The silence that surrounded such cruelty was not accidental. It was cultivated, protected, and reinforced by everyone who benefited from the system or feared challenging it. In societies built on enslavement, silence became a form of participation, a way to preserve comfort while violence unfolded just beyond the edge of polite conversation. People knew, they always knew, but knowing did not mean acting. It meant lowering voices, averting eyes, and convincing themselves that what happened inside certain households was not their concern. This silence began at the highest levels of authority. Laws were written to protect property, not people, and enslaved bodies were legally classified as possessions rather than lives. When abuse was reported, it was filtered through language that softened its reality, described as discipline, correction, or household management. Officials who could have intervened often chose not to, fearing social backlash or economic loss. By refusing to name cruelty for what it was, the system ensured it could continue without disruption. Religious institutions also played a role in maintaining this quiet. Sermons preached obedience and order, rarely questioning who benefited from that order or who suffered beneath it. Priests heard confessions, saw injuries, listened to whispered fears, yet rarely spoke publicly against the violence. Moral authority was diluted by dependence on elite patrons, and compassion was sacrificed to stability. Silence became sanctified, wrapped in language of patience and divine will. Neighbors were perhaps the most complicit witnesses. They heard screams carried by the wind, saw injuries hidden poorly beneath fabric, noticed sudden disappearances within households. Rumors circulated quietly, transformed into gossip rather than alarm. Speaking openly meant risking social isolation, retaliation, or accusations of meddling. In communities where reputation mattered more than justice, it was easier to pretend ignorance than to confront horror. This collective quiet taught perpetrators that they were untouchable. Each unchallenged act of cruelty reinforced the belief that there would be no consequences. Power thrives in silence, feeding on the absence of resistance. When no one speaks, violence feels permitted, even endorsed. The lack of accountability allowed abuse to escalate, pushing boundaries further each time without fear of reprisal. For the victims, this silence was as devastating as the violence itself. Knowing that others were aware yet unwilling to intervene stripped away any remaining belief in rescue or justice. It confirmed that their suffering was not an aberration, but an accepted part of the social order. Isolation deepened, hope diminished, and survival became a solitary effort carried out in the shadows of indifference. Silence also shaped how history would later remember these events. Records were incomplete, testimonies erased, stories buried beneath polite narratives of progress and civilization. What was documented often centered the perspectives of the powerful, minimizing or justifying abuse. By controlling the narrative, society ensured that cruelty would fade into abstraction, its victims reduced to numbers or footnotes rather than remembered as human beings. Women who inflicted violence were shielded by this same silence. Their actions were excused as emotional excess, household stress, or eccentricity, rather than recognized as calculated brutality. Gender became both a shield and a disguise, allowing cruelty to hide behind expectations of femininity and domesticity. The idea that a woman could be a monster was too uncomfortable for society to confront, so it chose denial instead. The normalization of silence extended into future generations. Children grew up learning which questions not to ask, which topics to avoid, which injustices were best left unexamined. This inherited quiet became tradition, passed down like an unspoken rule. Over time, the absence of outrage felt natural, and cruelty lost its shock value, absorbed into the background noise of daily life. Silence also served as a warning. Those who considered speaking out watched what happened to others who dared to challenge the system. Social exile, economic ruin, or worse, awaited those who broke the unwritten code. Fear enforced quiet more effectively than any law. In this way, silence became self-perpetuating, sustained by both convenience and terror. The most insidious aspect of this silence was how it transformed responsibility. When everyone knows but no one speaks, guilt becomes diffuse, spread thin enough that no single person feels accountable. Atrocity becomes a shared secret, and shared secrets are harder to confront because they implicate everyone. This diffusion allowed ordinary people to see themselves as separate from the violence, even as they benefited from it. In the end, silence did not merely allow cruelty, it shaped it, refined it, and protected it. It created the conditions in which violence could flourish without interruption, wrapping horror in respectability and routine. The screams that went unanswered, the wounds that went unseen, the lives that disappeared without question, all testify to a society that chose comfort over conscience, order over justice, and quiet over humanity, leaving behind a legacy where absence of voice became as lethal as the whip, and where the true horror lies not only in what was done, but in how many people decided not to speak, not to see, not to remember, allowing evil to breathe freely within the spaces they called normal, civilized, and necessary. Psychological terror functioned as the most efficient tool of control because it required no constant physical force, only the presence of fear embedded deep within the mind. Once fear took root, it governed thoughts, movements, and even silence. Enslaved women learned quickly that survival depended not on strength, but on anticipation. Every sound, every shift in tone, every change in routine carried potential meaning, and meaning could lead to punishment. The mind became a battlefield long before the body was ever touched. This form of terror thrived on unpredictability. When rules were unclear or constantly changing, obedience could never be perfected. No amount of compliance guaranteed safety. This uncertainty forced constant self-surveillance, compelling enslaved women to monitor their expressions, posture, and even thoughts. Over time, fear no longer needed an external trigger. It lived internally, shaping behavior automatically, eliminating the need for visible chains. Psychological terror also dismantled identity. When a person is repeatedly told they are worthless, dangerous, or deserving of pain, those messages begin to replace self-perception. Enslaved women were made to feel responsible for their own suffering, taught that punishment reflected personal failure rather than cruelty inflicted upon them. This internalization of blame weakened resistance more effectively than violence alone, because it turned the victim against herself. Humiliation was a critical component of this terror. Punishment often targeted dignity rather than life, leaving emotional scars that could not be hidden or healed easily. Shame lingered long after wounds closed, shaping how victims saw themselves and how they believed others saw them. This shame discouraged solidarity, isolating individuals within their trauma. When humiliation becomes routine, it fractures trust and prevents collective strength from forming. Fear was also reinforced through observation. Witnessing the punishment of others served as a warning more powerful than direct experience. The screams, the aftermath, the sudden absences, all communicated consequences without explanation. Enslaved women learned through watching, absorbing terror secondhand, imagining what might be done to them next. This indirect violence multiplied suffering, allowing one act of cruelty to control many lives simultaneously. Sleep offered no refuge. Psychological terror invaded rest, filling dreams with threats and memories. Nights were haunted by anticipation, mornings by dread. Exhaustion weakened the mind's defenses, making fear harder to resist. Over time, Constant stress altered perception itself, narrowing focus to immediate survival and erasing the capacity to imagine a different future. When hope disappears, control becomes effortless. The household environment amplified this terror through intimacy. There was no clear boundary between private and public, safety and danger. The same hands that ordered meals could order punishment. Familiar spaces became sites of anxiety, stripped of comfort. Even moments of calm felt unstable, temporary, deceptive. This instability kept enslaved women in a permanent state of alertness, draining emotional strength. Psychological terror also relied on silence as reinforcement. The inability to speak openly about suffering intensified isolation. When pain cannot be shared, it grows heavier. Fear thrives in secrecy, feeding on the absence of validation. Without acknowledgement, victims questioned their own perceptions, wondering whether cruelty was normal, deserved, or imagined. This confusion further weakened resistance. Control extended beyond the individual to shape relationships. Distrust was encouraged, intentionally or not, by systems that rewarded compliance and punished solidarity. Enslaved women learned that closeness could be dangerous, that confiding might lead to betrayal under pressure. Fear fractured bonds, turning survival into a solitary pursuit. Isolation ensured that terror remained individualized, preventing collective defiance. Over time, psychological terror reshaped behavior so thoroughly that overt violence became unnecessary. Obedience was internalized, enforced by memory and anticipation rather than immediate threat. This efficiency made terror invisible to outsiders who saw order instead of fear, routine instead of coercion. The absence of visible chaos was mistaken for stability, masking the constant mental suffering beneath the surface. This form of control also protected perpetrators from confrontation. When fear silences victims before they speak, abuse leaves fewer traces. Psychological wounds are harder to document, easier to dismiss. The damage remains real, but unseen, allowing cruelty to persist without challenge. Terror became self-sustaining, requiring no justification, no defense, no explanation. Perhaps the most devastating effect of psychological terror was how it altered time itself. The future shrank, reduced to the next hour, the next task, the next mood of those in power. Long-term dreams dissolved under constant threat. Life became a series of calculations meant to avoid harm rather than seek fulfillment. When existence is reduced to avoidance, humanity itself feels suspended. Psychological terror was not loud, but it was relentless. It whispered rather than shouted, lingered rather than struck. It shaped behavior through fear of possibility rather than certainty, teaching that anything could happen at any time for any reason. In such an environment, control did not need chains, locks, or guards. It lived inside the mind, conditioning obedience through dread, erasing resistance through exhaustion, and ensuring that even in moments of apparent calm, fear remained present, watchful, waiting, embedded so deeply that escape felt unimaginable, and the greatest prison was no longer the household but the thoughts shaped within it. The belief that great evil invites supernatural consequence has followed humanity across cultures and centuries, especially in societies where formal justice failed to reach those in power. When cruelty went unpunished by law, people searched for meaning elsewhere, and the idea of curses, decay, and divine retribution filled the void left by human inaction. In environments shaped by fear and silence, stories of punishment beyond death became a way to restore moral balance, even if only in memory and belief. Within the enslaved communities, these beliefs were not abstract superstition, but a form of emotional survival. When justice was impossible in life, it was imagined in another realm. The suffering inflicted by the powerful was too vast, too extreme to be left unanswered, and so the idea emerged that no one who committed such acts could escape consequence forever. Whispers of sickness, rot, and slow decay became symbols of an unseen reckoning, offering a sense that cruelty carried a cost, even if delayed. The physical deterioration of those known for brutality often became evidence of this belief. Illness, skin decay, madness, and isolation were interpreted not as coincidence, but as manifestations of accumulated evil turning inward. When a body weakened or began to rot while still alive, it was seen as punishment written directly onto flesh. These interpretations spread quickly among the enslaved, carried through whispered stories that transformed fear into a fragile form of hope. Decay held particular symbolic power. Rot is slow, humiliating, and unavoidable. Unlike sudden death, it mirrors the prolonged suffering inflicted on others. To believe that a cruel master or mistress was decaying from within was to believe that pain had memory, that the body itself could not hold so much violence without collapsing. This belief reframed illness as justice, weakness as exposure, and isolation as consequence. Divine punishment also played a central role in these narratives. Religious language was often used to justify enslavement and obedience, but it could also be reclaimed by the oppressed. If God was invoked to enforce order, then God could also be imagined as witnessing cruelty. Stories of divine wrath offered a counter-narrative to sermons about submission, suggesting that true judgment lay beyond earthly hierarchies. This belief restored a sense of moral order where none existed. These ideas were reinforced when those known for cruelty died alone, feared, or abandoned. Isolation at the end of life was interpreted as proof that evil ultimately consumes itself. To be surrounded by servants yet utterly alone carried symbolic weight. The absence of love, loyalty, or mourning became part of the punishment. Death without comfort was seen as fitting for those who denied comfort to others. Curses also functioned as warnings. They transformed individual acts of cruelty into lasting legacies of fear. The idea that a household, lineage, or name could be marked by evil discouraged future excess, at least in imagination. Stories of haunted rooms, restless spirits, and lingering sickness kept memory alive, ensuring that cruelty was not forgotten even when records were erased. These narratives preserved truth in a form that could survive censorship and denial. For the wider society, belief in curses offered a way to acknowledge wrongdoing without confronting it directly. Instead of demanding accountability, people explained suffering as fate, divine will, or supernatural consequence. This allowed them to feel moral closure without challenging power structures. While this belief comforted the powerless, it also absolved the complicit, shifting responsibility away from human action and into the realm of myth. Yet within oppressed communities, these stories carried deeper meaning. They were not merely about punishment, but about balance. They asserted that cruelty disrupts the natural order and that such disruption must eventually be corrected. Even when justice was delayed beyond a lifetime, belief in consequence restored a sense of dignity to those who suffered. It affirmed that their pain mattered, that it was seen, recorded, and answered in some form. The image of someone rotting while alive blurred the line between physical illness and moral corruption. The body became a reflection of the soul, revealing what had been hidden beneath power and privilege. This symbolism resonated deeply in cultures where the body was already a site of control and punishment. To see the oppressor's body fail was to witness a reversal of roles, however temporary or symbolic. These beliefs endured long after the events themselves, passed down through oral tradition, shaping how history was remembered when official accounts remained silent. They preserved emotional truth even when factual details were lost. The curse became a vessel for collective memory, carrying lessons about power, cruelty, and consequence across generations. In the absence of justice, belief became resistance. To imagine that evil could not escape consequence was to refuse the idea that suffering was meaningless. Even if punishment came through decay, madness, or isolation rather than courts or laws, it restored a sense of moral coherence to a world defined by violence. These stories did not erase trauma, but they transformed it into narrative, into warning, into memory that refused to let cruelty fade quietly, ensuring that those who inflicted unimaginable pain were not remembered as untouchable figures of authority, but as corrupted beings whose power could not protect them forever, whose bodies betrayed their sins, whose names became associated not with dominance but with rot, fear, and the belief that no evil remains unanswered, even when the answer comes slowly, invisibly, written into flesh rather than spoken aloud.